Hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be hosting this discussion today. We're pleased to have Efraim Inbar, President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, join us to discuss a renewed Iran deal and Israel's options. Dr. Inbar will speak for 15 minutes and answer questions. As this is a pre-recorded webinar, we will not be taking questions. And with that, I will now play the webinar with Efraim Inbar.
I will say a few words about a potential deal between the United States and Iran. The US has been desperate to get a deal, and because it wants to do other things in the world. And now I think it's even more desperate to get the Iran file out of its sight. Because Iran is indeed now less important to the United States, the whole issue. It has, for several reasons. First of all, it has a war in Ukraine, and it is busy trying to defeat the Russians. It's fighting until the last Ukrainian, and it may take some time because it's going to be probably a prolonged war. So it has, Iran is less important for the United States nowadays. But at the same time, we have an energy crisis. And the Americans want the American oil, the Iranian oil, excuse me, to be on the market. It has inflation, and of course, more oil might reduce the energy prices that drive many Americans crazy. If we take a look at Europe, I think we see a similar situation. The Europeans were much less concerned than Americans about Iranian nuclear threat. And they are, of course, now, like the Americans, busy with Russia. It was a shock for them that there is a war in Europe, and they try to change their beliefs that they are living in a paradise, and they are dealing primarily with Russia. But the energy crisis hits them even more harder than the Americans, and they want as well Iran to join the world and get rid of the sanctions, be able to sell freely its energy resources to the world. And we should realize that the Europeans always wanted to have access to the Iranian market. They want to export. It's a large country. They want to do business with Iran. And as a result of that, of course, they are less willing to put pressure on Iran in order to sign a favorable deal for international security. Now the negotiations are stuck over the Iranian demands for removing the Islamic Revolutionary Guards from the terrorist list that the United States has. I think that eventually we'll see an agreement, and try to explain why. Iran, they are hard bargainers. They have a bazaar mentality. There are no fixed prices in the Iranian bazaar, and they every price is subject for negotiations. They also have time. This is their mentality, part of their mentality. There is no rush to get a deal, and this explains why they procrastinated for so long. And nowadays, obviously, they understand that the West is more under pressure to get a deal than before, and they will try to get an advantage in whatever deal is going to be signed. In the meantime, we see Iran escalating their behavior on the nuclear issue. Just to remind you of a few things, Iran refuses to supply information or an explanation to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna about the findings of traces of uranium in several places. This is part of the military program of Iran that was exposed by the nuclear archives that the Israeli Mossad smuggled away. And indeed, the IAEA censored Iran for this behavior. And the Iranians simply said that this is a hostile behavior on part of this international organization, and are actually willing to cooperate less with this watchdog. They informed Iran of installing 2 new cascades of centrifuges at Natanz, and those centrifuges, IR6, are actually 10 times as fast as those that were allowed by the 2015 JCPOA. And the JCPOA actually allowed Iran to continue their research on centrifuges, and indeed they succeeded in producing much faster centrifuges that will produce faster fissionable material, which is necessary for a bomb. Iran also removed, in reaction to the IAEA decision, surveillance cameras in their nuclear installations that are supposed to be inspected and surveyed by this organization. And also, Iran has been halting the footage of many cameras that were installed by the international watchdog, and again, signaling that they are resolute in continuing to hold on to their position. So Iran indeed escalates in the dialogue with the West and with the International Atomic Energy Agency. The big question is, of course, will Iran miss the opportunity to sign a new agreement, a new JCPOA with the international community? The Russian poet Pushkin, has a famous fable about the fisherman's wife. The fisherman caught a fish that wanted to be freed and promised many things to the fisherman, but every time the wife wanted more and more, and eventually this fish was able to free itself, and the fisherman's wife remains with nothing. I doubt very much if this fable is applicable to the Iranians, because they want a deal. The deal will legitimize their nuclear program, and they want this legitimacy. Of course, they also want the $100 billion that are intended to go to Iran if the sanctions end. There's a lot of money. Much of it will go, of course, to the pockets of the elite there, but some of it will also filter down to the people, and they are in bad economic shape, so they want definitely the money and to continue with their nuclear program, knowing well that they can get away with many violations of this agreement. I think also an agreement will minimize the legitimacy or even deny the legitimacy to Israeli probable military action against the Iranian nuclear reactor. Moreover, the West, in my view, will not end the negotiation and tell the Iranians, that's it, you used up your time and now you are without an agreement. They will continue to play the game. We just heard the Biden administration telling the Iranians that despite the decision at the IAEA, they will continue to negotiate with the Iranians about an agreement, a nuclear agreement, and they may even make concessions because they want this agreement to remove this piece, this issue from their agenda. Therefore, I think that eventually we'll have an agreement, and I'm not sure this is a good development. Israel definitely prefers a situation where there is no agreement, precisely because of the reasons that Iran wants an agreement, because it legitimizes continuous military program of the Iranians. With no agreements, there will be continuous economic pressure on Iran, although this is not a central issue. International sanctions have proved effective only in few cases in the world. Cuba was under international sanctions for many years, American sanctions. Also, Venezuela is under sanctions, and those sanctions didn't change the behavior of those states. And of course, with no agreement, Israel will have greater legitimacy for continuing the military conflict with Iran and its ability to make good on its promise to end by force this nuclear program. And actually, we should recognize that there is a war going on between Iran and Israel. And if there will be an agreement or there will be no agreement, we'll see an escalation in this war that is going on between Iran and Israel. We've seen it also in the recent weeks. In recent weeks, we've seen in Israeli intensified efforts in several areas. First of all, in eliminating Iranian personnel involved in the nuclear program, primarily nuclear scientists. We've seen a greater effort in eliminating Iranian personnel involved in planning terrorist activities against Israel. And we've seen, of course, the Iranians reacting to that. We've seen Israeli intensified activities to affect negatively the capabilities of Iran to attack Israel. For example, we've seen attacks on their United UAVs, unmanned air vehicles. About 100 of them were destroyed by an attack from an unnamed source. We've seen last week an Israeli attack on the Syrian airport in Damascus, attacking the runways. And this is a clear escalation because the Damascus International Airport is clearly a civilian target. Nevertheless, Israel decided to hit the airport in order to prevent further transport of equipment that could help Hezbollah make their missiles more accurate, which are a problem for Israel. Hezbollah has over 100,000 missiles in Lebanon, and most of them are not accurate. If those are becoming accurate, the price Israel might pay from a Hezbollah attack might be much more costly. And I think that there are additional arenas in which we may see a clear armed conflict between the two countries. The Iranians may attack Jewish targets abroad. We've seen an attempt by Iran to attack Israeli tourists in Turkey. And as a result of Turkish-Israeli cooperation, this attack was prevented. But we should assume that they will continue with this type of attacks, maybe against Jewish targets elsewhere, against Israeli consulates, maybe embassies. They tried that in the past. They were not always very successful, but this is a clear arena where we may see further Iranian activity. I think another clear arena is, of course, Lebanon. There is one area of dispute in which Hezbollah made clear threats against Israel, and this is exploration of gas in the exclusive economic zone in the north of Israel. There is a dispute between Israel and Lebanon. The Americans tried for years to try to bring an understanding, and Hezbollah basically blocked any possible agreement between Israel and Lebanon, despite the fact that Lebanon is in a dire economic situation, and having an agreement on Israel on gas exploration in this area can bring them a lot of economic benefits. So this is, we may expect Hezbollah attacked on a ship that is, or in a gas rig. By the way, Israeli gas rigs were already attacked by Hamas in the past. So this is a clear arena where we may see armed conflict between Israel and one of Iranian's proxies. We may see also armed conflict in the Red Sea. We should remember that the Houthis are proxies of Iran in Yemen. They are in control of strategic sites along the Red Sea. We've seen in the past Iranian ships, primarily for intelligence purposes, being there and having a conflict with Israel. We may see again Iranian ships in the Red Sea, and also it's quite clear that the Iranians were equipped by Iran with long-range missiles that, according to the Iranian and Houthi claim, can reach southern Israel, in particular the southern port of Eilat. So this is another area where we may see greater conflict between the two countries. Another area which we've seen only recently, a armed conflict between the two countries is KRG, the Kurdish independent region in northern of Iraq. The Iranians attacked by UAVs and missiles certain sites that they claimed were part of the Israeli presence there. And this is something that I'm sure the Israelis are concerned, because indeed there is an Israeli presence in this area, which is close to Iran. It has a border with Iran, and it is useful to Israel for several purposes. So we may see an escalation. We should be aware that Israel at this time probably is not ready for an attack on the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Unfortunately, because of the many elections in Israel, the Netanyahu government neglected to develop the option of a preventive strike, and only the new government, headed by Prime Minister Bennett, allocated the money that is needed to upgrade Israeli capabilities in order to execute effectively such an attack. And indeed, Israel is acquiring the materials, is training over the Mediterranean in order to be better prepared when it will be ordered, the military, when it will be ordered to carry out an attack on the Iranian key nuclear installations. Our institute, the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, has actually advocated and presented to the government a proposal for preemptive strikes against Iranian proxies as soon as possible, for several reasons. First of all, because Israel, as I mentioned, is not ready yet to carry out the necessary military steps to neutralize the Iranian military nuclear capability. Also, I think we should attack the proxies in order to reduce the price that Israel will have to pay in case that Israel will attack Iran. Iran is aiding those proxies and is to some extent restraining them in order to prepare them for attacking Israel in the case that Iran is attacked. This is, of course, true of Hezbollah and also of Hamas. So in order to reduce the price in the future, it is necessary to attack as soon as possible in order to destroy particularly the missile capabilities of Hezbollah and Hamas. Finally, I think it's very important to realize that the Abraham Accords are at stake. If we don't do any muscular action against Iran, the Abraham Accords may disappear. As Gulf countries reach the conclusion that as America exits the region, it is only Israel that can effectively put an end to an Iranian nuclear threat. And if we don't show that we are serious about it at this time by attacking the proxies, those countries will have second thoughts about the utility of the Abraham Accords for their own countries. After all, we should realize that the Gulf countries can acquire, they have enough money to acquire almost any technology, be it civilian, be it military. And obviously they do not come to Israel because of its market. After all, Israel is a small market. And they are recognizing the state of Israel and have normal relations with Israel only because in their mind, we carry the promise of putting an end to the Iranian nuclear program. Therefore, Israel has to act sooner. Actually, we see in Israel a greater consensus than ever before in the defense establishment about the need to confront militarily Iran, because there is no other way to prevent them from becoming nuclear. Of course, we have to take into consideration that if we'll have a political crisis and the government will fall, we'll have another elections, things may get a bit messy at the political level. Hopefully, Israeli politicians will be responsible enough to understand what is important and what is less important. And I finished my presentation now, and I'm ready to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor. That was quite a summary of a very complex geopolitical situation here. I definitely have some questions. You talked in the beginning about energy resources and turning to Iran, possibly for our oil and natural gas. And I was just curious, isn't Israel sitting on an incredible reserve of oil? And why would Biden go to Iran or Venezuela and not to an ally?
Well, we should be aware that the Israeli gas reserves are limited.
Yeah.
And we are an exporter of energy to our neighbors, to the Palestinian Authority, to Jordan, to Egypt even. But our capability to export is limited, also due to technical issues. So we don't have a pipeline to move the gas to Europe. We don't have the capacity to ship liquefied gas abroad. We may have to do it via Egypt that has excess capacity. But so far, there is no immediate capability of Israel to supply Europe with gas.
Understood. Also, you mentioned the IRGC designation, right, as a terrorist group. And you are under the assumption that at some point a deal will take place between the US and Iran. So somebody's going to have to give on that front. The Biden administration has recently said it would not budge on taking the IRGC off of the terrorist designation. Do you think that they're going to change their mind, or do you think it will be the Iranians?
I'm not sure who will give up its position first. It seems that the American defense establishment is behind the Biden decision. But I do not rule out the possibility that Iran at the last moment will make a concession in order to get the benefits of a nuclear agreement with the international community.
And you think an agreement would be far worse than removing the IRGC from an FTO list?
I'll be happy that there would be no agreement. This is the best option,
Sure.
as far as I'm concerned. All the details are less important. the Iranian will continue with their subversive and terrorist activities, no matter if the Islamic, Revolutionary Guards are removed from the list of terrorist organization of America. They are now on the list, and they continue to do it. So what? They have more logistical problems. That's all.
Absolutely, makes sense. There's quite a bit of opposition to the Iran deal in the U.S., including in Congress, which is why Obama circumvented going through Congress the first time by not making it an actual official treaty where both parties had to sign the document. You mentioned at the beginning that there's a lot of pressure for the Biden administration to sign this deal. Where is this pressure coming from? Is it the Democratic Party? Is it Europe?
I think, first of all, there is a strategic decision on part of the Americans that they have to concentrate on China. Pivoting to China has been a policy which has been announced by Obama, Trump, and Biden. It's a strategic decision on part of three administrations. And in order to do that, they have to divert some of their energies and military forces from other arenas. And this is why the Americans have decided to reduce their presence in the Middle East. Nowadays, there is an additional pressure. The war in Ukraine, which the United States was totally unprepared. They help the Ukrainians in many ways, but it transpires that they do not have the capability to produce as many anti-tank missiles as they want to send to Ukraine. So they have a problem, an additional problem now. This is Russia, which is to some extent aligned with China. China and Russia both want to undermine the American hegemony in the world. And therefore, Iran becomes even more of a nuisance for them. Iran is not a real threat for America. They don't believe that the Iranian missiles that can probably reach the United States will be really sent to the United States. And they can deter Iran. Therefore, they want to remove Iran from the agenda when they have two more pressing issues. Before it was just one, now they have another one, Russia.
I see. So you're basically saying that the pressure to sign a deal comes from this ideological, strategic imperative to get the U.S. out of the Middle East and onto, more focused on its other issues.
Although the energy issue may bring the Americans to some extent back into the Middle East, but they want, if there is going to be their presence, they want an Iran that is able to supply the world energy market.
Understood.
So it is, the international constraints are such that America wants a deal. And of course, there is domestic pressure from forces that are close to the progressives or some in the State Department, that want a deal and believe, as in the past, that Iran will accept the deal and will become a responsible international actor. All those hopes of 2015, of course, didn't materialize, but they are convinced that this time it will be different.
Understood. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the close of our webinar. Thank you so much, Professor Inbar, for joining us today. Before we go, could you just tell our viewers quickly where they can find some more of your work?
We have a website, the jiss.org.il, where the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security publishes all of its research and policy papers. And you are all welcome to look at it, to register for our newsletters, and join our conferences and our briefings.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. For our viewers, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us and I hope you have a wonderful day.